Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 185 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Joseph Laycock, an assistant professor of religious studies at Texas State University and author of the nonfiction books Spirit Possession Around the World and Vampires Today. And we'll be talking with him about his new book, Dangerous Games, which explores the satanic panic that surrounded Dungeons & Dragons in the 1980s. And for more on that, you might also want to check out our panel on the history of Dungeons & Dragons in episode 170. And now, here's our interview with Joseph Laycock. All right, so we're here with Joseph Laycock. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Okay, so first of all, just tell us a bit about your history as a Dungeons & Dragons player.
Well, I talk about this in the preface of the book. I think I first learned about the concept of Dungeons & Dragons when I was pretty young. I mean, maybe 6 or 7 years old at a summer camp for gifted kids. But what we were doing was not actually Dungeons & Dragons. It was sort of a, more of a cops and robbers type of make-believe game. It wasn't until later that I realized this is a real game played with dice, and you actually have to do a lot of reading and a lot of study to learn how to play it. By high school, I was a pretty big D&D nerd, and that continued on into college when I was involved in my gaming group at Hampshire College. Sadly, I have not played D&D in a long time. I think the last time I was able to do that was with a group of graduate students at Emory University, and that must have been back around 2007 or so.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you talk in the book about how there was this big hostility among parents and the media toward Dungeons & Dragons. How much did that affect you at that time?
So I grew up in Austin, Texas, which is Austin is sort of a blue dot in a big red state. But there was still a lot of hostility from conservative Christians towards this game. And I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, so this was really the height of the satanic panic and the fear that Satanists live among us and are abducting children and torturing them in daycare centers and putting subliminal messages into rock music and things like this. So I was pretty affected by it, and there were a lot of people that I talked to as a kid, adults, who just assumed out of hand that this game was part of some kind of satanic conspiracy. And of course, when you're a kid, you can't just tell an adult, right, so that they're ignorant and that they need to read a book or something, right? Because it's an unequal power dynamic. So this was kind of my first suspicion that adults were fallible, right? That they seemed that they knew everything, but that they clearly didn't, because they thought that this game had something to do with religion and something to do with Satan worship.
Right, so I mean, we must be about the same age, because I had the same thing. And for example, when I was in high school, they wouldn't let us play Dungeons & Dragons at school, because, I don't know, they thought it was evil or something. And I've said before on the show that as a result of that, a bunch of my friends just decided that they would, it would have been nice to play Dungeons & Dragons at school, but they could just go home and do drugs instead. And it was this really counterproductive strategy, I thought, for the school. Absolutely. And of course, there were campaigns all over the country, mostly led by parents to try and ban it from schools or ban it from libraries. And researching this book, I even found someone who ran for Attorney General of Virginia, and his whole platform was, I will get this terrible game out of our schools. Yeah. Well, and there's a moment in the book you talk about when you're a kid and a bully is picking on you. Tell us about that. Yeah, so, when I was in middle school, I had a student who I'm a teacher now, so I think of them as students, but older and larger than me, maybe an 8th grader. And I think that he had just kind of heard a sermon from his pastor that weekend or something like that about why this game was evil, and told a friend and I who were talking about the game, you guys worship gods from books, and that's just sad. And we kind of tried to discuss this with him about this is not a religious thing, this has nothing to do with worshiping anything. But he kind of stuck to this soundbite of you worship gods from books. And at the time, I couldn't articulate why that was such a weird thing to say. But one, it was very odd that this was being framed as a religious thing. It obviously had nothing to do with worship. But the other thing that was ironic was, I was at a Christian school. But most Christians, know about their God primarily through a book, right? Through the Bible. I mean, a few people
believe that God speaks to them personally, but generally this is it's the Christians who are worshiping gods from books, right? Not the D&D players. So there was a very strange kind of reversal there, where I found that a lot of the claims makers were actually engaging in the very sort of behavior that they were accusing D&D players of doing. And it wasn't until much later in my life, when I had a background in the sociology of religion, that I was actually able to kind of articulate some of those suspicions that I had as a kid.
Right. Well, and you're now a professor of religious studies. And to what extent does this kind of experiences you had as a kid, did that play into that at all, that interest?
Yeah, I think it did. One of the reasons that I think games like Dungeons and Dragons are so important is that when you are making models of the world, even if it's not a real world, even if it's a fantasy world with magic and dragons and things like this, it kind of forces you to take things apart and think really hard about how things work. And I think that when you do that, it gives you a kind of an ability to think about the world that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I think that playing Dungeons and Dragons does prepare you to do things like anthropology and sociology and so forth. And I know so many professors at this university and at other universities who played a lot of D&D growing up. I almost never have to explain to another professor what D&D is.
Okay, and so this new book is called Dangerous Games. So how did this book specifically come about?
Well, this was my first book after my big dissertation project. So I kind of had a moment to catch a breath and really write a book that I wanted to write. I was not working on to kind of prove my credentials to the university where I got my PhD or anything like this. And it was something that I wanted to work on for a long time, because I have had kind of a chip on my shoulder since about the 6th grade about this. And as I talked about it with other academics and other religion scholars, people got really excited and said, you should write this book. And so the University of California Press was excited about taking a chance on this. And that's how it came together.
So have you sent a copy of it to that 8th grade bully?
I don't even remember his name. And I'm sure that, people mature, right? I'm sure that he is not still looking for people with weird hobbies to pick on anymore.
So you've done all this research on this now. So what have you kind of concluded about why some people were so hostile to Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, I think that one book that was really interesting was a book by a sociologist named Stanley Cohen called Scapegoats and Moral Panics. And a moral panic is, in sociology, when a society becomes convinced that something is kind of threatening to undermine the society or threatening to ruin it. So in medieval times, this would have been, the Jews, right, are trying to steal Christian blood. Right now, we have claims like this about immigrants, or some of the more outrageous claims about Planned Parenthood or terrorism or things like this. But to get a really good moral panic, right, you need a scapegoat, and the ideal scapegoat is someone who can't fight back, right? Someone who has no actual political power in the society. So when the only people playing Dungeons and Dragons were kids, kids can't fight back. You can make whatever sorts of claims you want. And Dungeons and Dragons was also useful because it occurs in the imagination. So you can't actually see the game. And so these claims makers were able to describe all these horrible scenarios involving torture and worshiping demons and things like this. And, for all you knew as a parent, that's really what your kids were imagining. So this was very useful for a lot of different types of claims being made. And so one thing I discovered was that the claims change over time. So in the 1970s, when Dungeons and Dragons began, Americans were really scared of cults. That's what we really didn't like, was groups like the Hare Krishnas and the Moonies and these new religious groups that were going to college campuses and recruiting college-age kids. And there was this fear of brainwashing in the 70s. And so that was originally the lens through which Dungeons and Dragons was interpreted. This is a type of brainwashing. It's a cult activity. And then in the 80s, we weren't scared of cults anymore, but now we were afraid of Satanists. And, the cults at least existed. The Satanists are basically a myth. There is no sort of organized criminal movement of Satanists. And so it caught up in that. And then by the 90s, it had begun to die down a little bit, but it still got revived very easily, especially after things like the Columbine shootings in 1999. And then it had shifted from Satanist to just this idea of super predators. So a super predator in the 90s was this idea of teenagers who have guns and no conscience and are basically just coming to get us. So in the 90s, both Democrats and Republicans promised to protect America from the super predators, and this fear of D&D got dragged up into that again. And it still lingers out there even today. So people like Pat Robertson on the 700 Club have still talked about how this is an evil game that's caused people to commit suicide and this sort of thing. But I think what's changed is that we're not kids anymore, and that once people actually have the ability to fight back against these claims, they fall apart pretty easily. So someone else will have to be scapegoated now instead of the gamers.
Well, I mean, one line that I think was really central to this book is you say, "This is the primary reason why some Christians found fantasy role-playing games so intolerable. If players can construct a shared fantasy complete with gods and demons, what assurance is there that Christianity is not itself a kind of game?"
That's right. And when I'm making that claim, I am not, trying to put on sort of my Richard Dawkins hat and say that religion is stupid or religion is a delusion or that God doesn't exist or anything like this. But I think that the critics themselves had that fear, right? The critics themselves began to worry that their religion, which they had invested so much in, could be something like this game. And there are a few cases where you see sort of smoking guns like this. So Patricia Pulling was the founder of an organization called BAD, which stood for Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. And this was sort of the group in the 80s for attacking D&D. And a reporter asked her, it's true that there are gods in these fantasy games, but why would you assume that people playing the games think these gods are real? Why wouldn't you assume that they don't see them as just characters in a book? And she said, well, children believe in God and they only know about him through, the Bible and their imagination. All right. So that was kind of her argument. And if you turn that on its head, it sounds like, well, then it sounds like you're kind of an atheist yourself, right? And you feel that there's a kind of foolishness inherent in believing the truth claims of religion. So I think that by attacking this imaginary game, that was one way of sort of shoving that thought down and not having to think about it anymore.
Right, and I just want to emphasize what you said, that if we draw parallels between fantasy literature and religion, it's not necessarily denigrating religion, because fantasy literature is my all-time favorite thing in the world. So, I take it very seriously. So, for me, comparing something to fantasy is not in any way an insult.
Sure, yeah. I think one case where I've been misunderstood is I'm not at any point in this book claiming that fantasy role-playing games are a religion. But I am setting up this comparison, and there's kind of a creative tension, right, by holding religion and fantasy games up side by side and looking at what the similarities are.
Right. I mean, one comment in the book I thought was really interesting is that there was a Christian Dungeons & Dragons player who made the point that essentially there was nothing Dungeons & Dragons could have done to avoid this. Because there's nothing particularly anti-Christian about Dungeons & Dragons. Gary Gygax, the creator of the game, was Christian himself. And basically, if they didn't include any religion, these people would have complained about that. If they included non-Christian religion, these people would have complained about that. And if they include Christian elements, people would complain that it's blasphemous and idolatrous. So there's nothing really inherent in the game that would have obviated these criticisms.
That's absolutely right. So there was a game created called Dragon Raid, which was created as something like D&D, but that would be specifically used to basically teach Sunday school to children, where, you get to a door and you have to have memorized a Bible verse. And if you can recite the Bible verse correctly, the door opens and this sort of thing. But that, too, was interpreted as an even more subtle way of sneaking the satanic agenda into the church. And so nobody, the primary audience for Dragon Raids was Christian teenagers, and their parents wouldn't let them buy it. So the game failed. So you're absolutely right. There's no winning with these people. There's no way to convince them that your game is not somehow a kind of satanic conspiracy.
And I mean, one thing that you talk about in the book that had never occurred to me before, but you say that in a way, the people who were attacking Dungeons and Dragons were involved in almost their own live-action role-playing game, where they take on the roles of heroic paranormal investigators battling the evil satanic conspiracy in much the same way that Dungeons and Dragons players imagine that they're warriors and wizards.
That's absolutely right. So when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about just sort of the suburban mother who is concerned that this game is unwholesome, but the people that were sort of actively writing books and making claims that this is connected to a kind of global sort of Illuminati conspiracy, or that demons can actually possess your children from playing the games. With these people, when I began to actually research who these people were, very quickly these were dangerous, unwell people. William Schnoebelen has written a great deal on the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons, and has said that he is a former Satanist and for a while was an actual vampire that subsisted entirely on human blood and would be burned by sunlight. I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary claim. It makes me wonder who is really losing touch with reality. Another major claims maker had her medical license revoked because she came to believe that she could diagnose spiritual illnesses and was abusing prescription painkillers. John Todd, another claims maker, died in a mental asylum. So a lot of these people actually seem to be constructing these worlds where they alone are fighting either supernatural forces or conspiratory forces. And I think that, on some level, we all need that. We all need to feel that our lives matter and the things that we do are important. But I think because these people had an unhealthy relationship with the imagination, they basically weren't able to let the imagination be its own sphere, separate from the world of daily life. That their kind of heroic aspirations took the form of conspiracy theories. So I think that a conspiracy theory is basically the fun and the psychological satisfaction of D&D, but without being given its own discrete kind of frame of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly one thing that struck me reading this book, is how many of these anti-Dungeons and Dragons crusaders were just dishonest, unethical people. And this extended even to like really bizarre ways in which they would. I mean, did you mention this guy Todd? He sort of claimed that he'd grown up in this witch family, and then when it was pointed out to him that he had ripped all this stuff off from the TV show Dark Shadows, he said, "Well, no, it was because I once flew to Hollywood and gave them a diary from my family, and so they actually based the show on my life." This sort of reversal of fact and fiction.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that was John Todd. Of course, John Todd grew up watching Dark Shadows, and he also was very influenced by the movie, that Lovecraft movie from the 70s, the Dunwich Horror, and said that the Necronomicon was a real book, that he had seen it. At one point, he said the Book of Mormon is based on the Necronomicon. And unfortunately, some of these claims are still out there because they get sort of diffused. So Jack Chick is this evangelical publisher who makes these little chick tracts that you find left at bus stops and things like this. And he famously made this one called Dark Dungeon, which is so about D&D, which is so popular that it gets sort of celebrated now at D&D conventions and things like this. But there's a character at the end of that comic who says he's a former witch, and that character is based on John Todd. So it's basically a cartoon of John Todd with his 70s handlebar mustache and everything. So it's very interesting how these really crazy people are able to find someone who will kind of disseminate their ideas, and then they get a little bit more diffused until you don't realize that these ideas are pretty crazy, right? So the intense paranoia gets diffused into just sort of a general paranoia.
Right, and one line in the book that really struck me is you say they condemn these games because this is the only way they can enjoy them.
That's right. So there's also this happens all the time, I think, with kind of the rhetoric of kids these days with their sort of unsavory activities. That there is a kind of delight in talking about how horrible these games are. So I think it was William Schnoebelen went through the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook with really a fine-tooth comb, and was sort of looking for the most kind of salacious things that he could find. And he found some really weird stuff that I didn't know about playing D&D for years. So there was some magic item that did random things, and I think if there was a 1 in 100 chance that it would give you Satiriasis, which is sort of a permanent erection, or things like that, right? Things that were obviously put in there as a joke, but they are sort of able to, and at the same time that they're condemning it, they're sort of vicariously enjoying all of these, all the sex and violence in this game. There's a great author called Jason Bivens who calls this the erotics of fear, right? That if you're sort of a moral entrepreneur, the things that scare you and that you claim are destroying society are also very exciting. And so I found that going on quite a bit in the rhetoric about why D&D is a dangerous game.
Well, right. And one commentator you quoted mentioned that you could do the same thing with the Bible. Just go through it and pick out all the incest and murder and everything like that.
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, there's so many passages from the Old Testament are absolutely horrifying, right? With people being raped and dismembered and incest and this sort of thing. But of course, that doesn't mean the Bible is a bad book, right? This is the problem of when you take a text and you attempt to interpret it without any awareness of the culture that it's associated with. So this is another interesting connection between the way we talk about religions and the way we talk about games like D&D.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of all those things, I was really also struck by this. This is an anti-D&D pamphlet, and it claims that D&D promotes demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, Satan worship, gambling, and Jungian psychology. And the Jungian psychology stands out as sort of odd in that list there. Can you explain to me why Jungian psychology is a bugbear for these people?
Well, no. I mean, I think that the fear was that Jungian psychology and the whole New Age is sort of a backdoor to get, the ideas of a rival religion sort of snuck in the form of something else. So I could understand why Jungian psychology was sort of on this list of things that scared conservative Christians or were upsetting to them. I'm not aware of anything in D&D that could be interpreted as Jungian psychology. I mean, Gary Gygax said, I like, tactical battles with swords. I don't like all this touchy-feely stuff in my role-playing games. I like strategy and this sort of thing. Some of the games that came about later in the 90s, I think, could maybe have a connection to psychology or the theories of Jung and this sort of thing. But I definitely don't see that in D&D. So in a way, that just shows how this is just sort of using D&D as a blank canvas to impose all of these other sorts of fears and anxieties on. And the best thing about that list you were reciting is I kept finding different versions of it, and it looks like it sort of got copied from conservative group to conservative group, and each group would add new things to it. So the first version I found had maybe 12 things, and by the end it had like 87 things. Where they had kind of found, so they would put Satiriasis. Now there's Satiriasis. We can put that on the list also, right?
Well, yeah, so you mentioned the 700 Club, and that was funny because they mentioned that the Dungeons & Dragons had this monster Moloch in it, and they said, oh, that's satanic. And you say that they actually didn't seem to realize that it's from the Bible, and that in a way, Gary Gygax and all these geeks playing Dungeons & Dragons knew the Bible better than these Christian groups that were attacking them.
They absolutely did. I mean, this is a problem. So Steve Prothero at Boston University is a religion professor and a public intellectual. And he said that basically America used to be, one of the most biblically literate countries on Earth, but that now we have a lot of Americans who don't know even very, very basic things about the Bible. I mean, how many Gospels there are and this sort of thing. And this is not just non-religious people, but Christians themselves, because evangelical Christianity emphasizes kind of the emotional experience of Christianity, not necessarily theology or interpreting the Bible. So you have this very strange situation on the 700 Club where Moloch, who is not, a super important biblical character, but appears several times in the Old Testament as sort of a rival god, worshipped by other people living in the Holy Land. But the people in the 700 Club have never heard of this, and they have to have this gamer explain to them that this is an actual biblical personage. And then this only convinces them further that this must actually be a satanic game, because this is a real demon, right? Real in quotation marks. So there's this very strange phenomenon where all of the Christian elements of the game were used as evidence that this was an anti-Christian game. So the fact that there are cleric spells that are biblical miracles, turning sticks into snakes, walking on water, this sort of thing, was all seen as evidence that this is somehow against Christianity. So it's the same thing. Gary Gygax really can't win. As much as he is himself a Christian, he can't persuade Christians that his game does not have an anti-Christian agenda.
Right. I mean, you actually quote a guy who is warning parents to look out for symptoms of satanic involvement. And the first item on his list is an unusual interest in the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very, very strange, and I think that this is connected also to this idea, to this realization that the way that we practice our religion is a little bit like this game, and sort of trying to think about it in a way that makes you forget about those similarities, right? To kind of make it seem more different than it actually is.
I don't know if you've seen the Pew Forum survey that came out recently that actually found that non-religious people had the greatest knowledge of the Bible of any religious, like quote-unquote religious group in the country.
Yeah, I have seen that survey. So I think the atheists did the best, and then I think it was the Jews. And the evangelicals did okay, but they did worse than a lot of these other groups. And that doesn't mean that evangelical Christianity is a bad way to do Christianity, or that they're bad people or anything like this. But as Christianity has moved from being very, very oriented in the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, I mean, going back to the 18th century, to today, where I hear from college students every day, right? Well, the important thing is I've accepted Jesus as my Savior, so I don't actually have to read the Bible. So I think in some ways we can see that kind of biblical illiteracy in this panic.
Yeah. All right, we'll talk about this line. All hegemonic movements are threatened by play and imagination.
Yeah, so when I say hegemony, right, this is one of these words that college professors like to throw around, right? But hegemony is basically, controlling, kind of controlling the rules of the game, or controlling society without sort of openly revealing that that's what you're doing, right? So in a way, I think that if you are a conservative Christian movement and you want other people to share your very kind of specific religious view of the world, and you want this to be passed on to your children and so forth, I think D&D absolutely does threaten that agenda, right? It threatens it because D&D gives people this kind of very radical autonomy to imagine the world in an infinite number of alternative ways, right? If the world that you have is the only world that you'll ever know, you can't really question it. But if every weekend you experience a different world with a different social order and a different way of organizing the government and different religions and so forth, then it becomes much easier to question people when they tell you this is the way the world is, this is what you ought to believe, and so forth. So on one level, I think that some of these Christian conservatives understood that this game is actually kind of empowering, and that is sort of a threat to them. So in that sense, they were not simply being hysterical, although they were maybe being a little bit dishonest about why the game was so upsetting to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and this idea that imagining other worlds could lead to social change is not purely theoretical, right? You talk about in history, there's something called the Axial Age where this happened.
Yeah, so the Axial Age is more of a way of thinking about things that historians of religion have created, as opposed to sort of an actual historical reality. But literature on the Axial Age began when a historian named Karl Jaspers in Germany noticed around 500 BC in 4 different parts of the world. In Israel, you have the Hebrew prophets, right? In Greece, you have the rise of philosophy. In China, you have the age of Confucius and Lao Tzu, and in India, you have the Buddha and the expansion of Hindu philosophy. So it says these people were not in contact with each other, but around the same time, they all began to get this idea of there's the world that we live in, which is sort of religious because we want the gods to kind of give us enough rain and help our crops grow and this sort of thing. But there's another world beyond this one, a transcendent world, and this is much more important. And so sociologists have said, well, probably that happened because, these societies reached a level of complexity around 500 BC where they could have a bunch of guys just sitting around and instead of working, were imagining things, right? Or could talk about what happens after you die and things like this. So the reason that this happens is in dispute. But what's not disputed is that after these ideas form, it sort of hits the acceleration button on cultural development, right? Because then once you have this idea of a transcendent order, whether that's God or sort of Platonic ideals of reason, or in China, the mandate of heaven or whatever, people can come up and say, no, the way that we're doing things in this society is wrong, right? It needs to be done this way because we know of this better order. So I think that there's something similar going on with D&D, right? And it's not going to be kind of world-changing in the way these ancient prophetic movements were. But, you come to think about your life a little bit differently from having spent a few hours imagining to be somebody else. So I found lots of testimony from gamers saying, I was only able to, join the Marines and serve in Desert Storm because I had learned through these games that I could be brave or that teamwork was valuable. So in that sense, I do think that these games do have a real impact on how people are able to think about their lives. So I think that's why the imagination is so powerful.
Right, and you actually mentioned a couple cases in the book where Dungeons and Dragons was used for therapy, right? There was one guy who works through his anger and another woman who recovers from depression because the character, she gains confidence through identifying with her character.
That's right, yeah. Well, I think one of the most interesting case studies was an adolescent who had tried to kill himself, and the therapist found that he enjoyed playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that was kind of his best sort of social outlet. And he played an evil character, a lawful evil character who was trying to, murder this rich man and marry his daughter and do all these sorts of things. And the therapist was actually able to sit down and say, well, why would somebody do that, right? Why would somebody be lawful but evil, and why would they want to do these things? And that sort of allowed him to kind of think about his own feelings and his relationship to his own family, and then he could sort of work it through. And I found that so interesting because the critics of D&D said playing an evil character is always wrong, right? That's always sort of guiding you towards being an evil person. And here it actually seemed to be just the opposite. It sort of gave this person the tools to think about why he was so angry all the time. And this actually was a much older debate about whether children should be allowed to hear stories that have monsters in them and so forth. And a child psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim said, you absolutely must read children's stories that have monsters in them, because when your child begins feeling angry and wanting to destroy things, if they think that they're the only person in the world who feels that way, they feel that they're the monster, right? That monsters and evil, and even to a certain extent, certain forms of violence can be a way of thinking about these problems and coming to terms with them.
Right. I mean, so people have attributed all these negative consequences to Dungeons and Dragons in various forms. What has been have there been scientific studies about that? Like, what does actual psychological literature show?
Yeah, there hasn't been, I think, great studies on this, but I mean, some of the things that we found out through surveys and things like this show absolutely no connection between playing Dungeons and Dragons and criminal activity or, worshiping the devil or anything like this. There have been some studies on, do children imitate violence that they see on television and things like this. I think those are sort of inconclusive, although it was interesting when there was one experiment where they controlled for how sort of imaginative the kids were. And in that study, it looked like the less imaginative kids would kind of imitate what they did they showed them a violent film with a clown, punching a balloon or something. But that the more imaginative kids actually felt sad after watching this because they kind of empathized with the characters and had this much sort of more thoughtful response to what they were seeing. So the studies are somewhat inconclusive, but there's no evidence to show that that this game leads to suicide or violent behavior or any of the other sort of negative activities that were claimed during the panic.
Right. I mean, you kind of suggest in the book that it's healthy to imagine the consequences of violence, because how else are you supposed to decide whether you want to engage in violence or not if you don't understand, if you can't visualize vividly what the consequences of that is going to be?
Well, absolutely, right? I mean, our whole justice system, our penal system is supposed to be about this idea that this is creating a deterrent, right? That people will not want this to happen to them, and so they will not commit crime. But that assumes a certain level to imagine, right? If I do this, what will the consequences of that action be? So I do wonder, if you've ever watched middle schoolers play D&D, often they say, well, I want to, rob the tavern or something like this, right? And it is a kind of thought experiment of what would happen if you just sort of flaunted the laws of society. I think more often, though, when people claim that this game leads to suicide and things like this, that what was really going on was there were specific cases where there were very obvious factors for why adolescents had committed suicide or committed murder and this sort of thing. But those we didn't want to think about those causes, and so we attributed to something much simpler. I found so many cases in the 80s that involved children playing with an unattended firearm, right, and ended up accidentally killing themselves. And then afterwards, the police would say, well, you did this because, you were playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? Isn't that the reason that you shot Timmy because you thought he was an orc or something like this? And where it gets really tragic is cases like Patricia Pulling, the founder of BAD. Her son committed suicide. From what I could tell, and including in one case talking to someone who knew her son, he was really furious at his parents who didn't have a good relationship with them. No parent wants to think they had something to do with their son committing suicide. And so she kind of dedicated her life to saying, my son killed himself because of this game. This game is making everyone commit suicide. And, I don't agree with what she did, but on one level, I understand it, right? Because who would want to believe that, you somehow failed to stop your child from committing suicide? Of course you would want to believe that sort of a game just can do this to someone instead, right?
Yeah, well, and you make the point, too, that it's comforting at one level to think there's this evil game that's turning kids into killers, etc., because then that implies that if you get rid of the game, problem solved, right? That, it makes the problem seem much less intractable than they would otherwise.
That's right. And this is where, evil conspiracy theories are actually, in a sense, comforting, because they do imply that as scary as the world may be, at least we ultimately have control over everything. And the reality is that we don't. The Onion put out an article recently that said, study shows every form of parenting will screw up your child, right? And I'm sure that's true, right? I mean, if your adolescent son kills himself, there's any number of factors, right? And you'll never have that satisfaction of knowing exactly why this happened or what could have happened differently and so forth. But if you can convince yourself it's this game causes suicide every time, then at least that sort of fear of the unknown is taken out of the equation. I think for some people that helps them sleep at night.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing I really want to ask you about is you talk about how these critics of D&D would attack Dungeons and Dragons for all these things while at the same time admiring the works of Tolkien and Lewis. Which seem very similar to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Could you talk about that contradiction?
Yeah, that was one of the weirdest things that I found. And apparently in the original Dark Dungeons comic strip, it said, go home and burn all your D&D books, including Tolkien and Lewis. And then I guess later they decided Tolkien and Lewis were okay, and the newer versions of the strip don't have that anymore. So that was very interesting, because I do think that these Christians who are writing about D&D on some level enjoyed fantasy, right? Because there's any number of, theological and political issues they could be talking about. So I think in one level they're attracted to D&D and to fantasy in general. I think they decided that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were okay because they were explicitly Christian, at least in the beginning. So I think that's part of it, is that everyone knows Tolkien's Christian. Everybody knows that the Chronicles of Narnia are a Christian allegory. But then they kind of tie themselves in knots saying why Tolkien and Lewis are okay, but things like Harry Potter and D&D are bad. And some of them really sort of geek out. So one author said, well, in the Harry Potter books, it's teaching that humans can do magic. But in Tolkien, only elves and wizards can do magic, and Gandalf isn't actually a human; he's actually a Maiar, right? And so this is not contradicting, God's natural order and things like that. I mean, really strange arguments. And I'm not entirely sure why they felt that was worth doing, but I think they sort of started out with the premise of Tolkien and Lewis are Christians, so they're okay, and then they kind of worked backwards from there.
Yeah, because you say, I mean, the idea is that if you open the door and step through into a fantasy world, anything could be waiting for you, and that's liberating for me. But then it's also challenging or frightening for somebody who's more close-minded. And I think you say that because Tolkien and Lewis are Christian, the implication for these people is, well, we can step through that door and we feel safe about it because we know that Christianity is waiting for us on the other side of that door.
Yeah, so I think you're right. There's another problem here, which is a discomfort with the genre of role-playing games, because in a book you can kind of skip to the end and decide, okay, is this a good Christian message or is this a bad message? But if you just don't know what the outcome can be, that can make some people really anxious, right? And of course, most D&D campaigns do not end with, the bad guys taking over the world, but they could. There's nothing in the rules that says that can't happen. And I think that that ambiguity or that uncertainty was also very upsetting to people who might otherwise enjoy fantasy.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning, too, that Tolkien himself would have absolutely no patience, it seems to me, for these people.
Oh, I think that's certainly true, and probably even Lewis as well, right? But Tolkien, especially with his writings on sort of the powers of imagination and things like this. He wrote a very important essay on escapism and why sort of using your imagination to escape is something very powerful and noble and not something to be mocked. Yeah, I think that he absolutely would not have anything to do with bad if he had lived to see them.
Because, I mean, some of these conservative pastors you mentioned are essentially advancing the argument that if you're trying to imagine another world, that's rejecting the world that God has created, and why are you doing that? Whereas for Tolkien, he had this whole idea of subcreation, where by creating your own world in fiction, you're doing the same thing that God did, and that's a good thing. That's a gift that God has given us, the ability to create these worlds.
Right. So Tolkien said that the imagination is a God-given faculty and we should use it. And he wrote this famous poem for Lewis back when Lewis was an atheist. Tolkien converted him, as a lot of people probably know, about the imagination as a sacred faculty. And Tolkien was not alone in that. There's a long history of Christian writings about sort of the power of the imagination as a faculty from God. But some of the critics of D&D took just the opposite view and said that, reality is what God wants it to be, and when you imagine an alternative reality, you're offending God, you're disrespecting him. And they took this almost to the point of basically saying, like, imagining a blue fire truck is blasphemous because God wants fire trucks to be red, because that's why fire trucks are red. And this is where this element of hegemony comes in. It has less to do with kind of Christianity and has a lot more to do with just sort of making sure everything is stable and everything cannot change. And it actually, this fear of the imagination and trying to sort of rein in what kinds of thoughts people are capable of having reminds me a lot of things like 1984. If people have read George Orwell's novel, the party is trying to maintain control by making language more and more limited, right? So people will not be able to express certain ideas. And I see some of the attacks on the imagination in these anti-D&D books doing something very similar, right? Trying to demonize the imagination so that capacity for change is eliminated and taken away.
Right. Well, and speaking of 1984 and that sort of totalitarianism, that's another thing that comes up in the book, because you have the author Michael Ende, who wrote the Neverending Story as a response to the Nazi Germany. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me about when I was a kid, and I remember, I had to be in some kind of after school or something like that, and so my parents could pick me up because they were professors too, and just watching the Neverending Story movie over and over again, because that was just sort of like that was sort of how they would get the kids to calm down or something until our parents came to pick us up. And then when I actually read the book, I realized this was a very profound book, and of course the author's father had been a painter whose work was condemned by the Nazis as deviant art. And so he became very interested in how, on the one hand, imagination is very, very freeing and provides this kind of wholesome faculty that humans need. But on the other hand, it can be sort of twisted and used by people like the Nazis, right? The Nazis famously used kind of romanticism to bestow their agenda. So in the book, in the movie, The Neverending Story, the characters keep getting sucked through the nothing, and it's just sort of a black hole, and you don't see them again. But in the book, the nothing actually sucks them out into the human world, where they become lies. So when they're in their own world, they're part of your imagination and they're healthy. When they're taken out of the world, they become lies, and they're used by evil people to sell products they don't need, or start wars that don't need to be fought, and things like this. And I thought that was such an apt metaphor for the way that, we all need these kinds of heroic adventures, but some of us can do it in a fantasy game. But for those who can't, because, who knows, they're convinced the imagination is satanic or something, they do that in the realm of conspiracy theories, right? And so I think that people like John Todd, who said that, he was a literal satanic witch and things like this, and he's fighting against these conspiracies, is sort of like the characters who have been sucked through the nothing, right? And so now they're not in the realm of imagination anymore, and now they're being used for evil. So it was a much more profound book than I expected to find when I started reading it.
Yeah, because all I really remember about the movie is that there's the dragon that looks like a dog and the guy who eats rocks. That's pretty much what I got out of the movie as a kid. Yeah,
so there's this werewolf type creature that's chasing the boy throughout the movie, and so that character in the book is a werewolf. So he lives in both realms, and in our world he's just this sort of grouchy human, and in the other world he's a giant wolf. So he's the only one that really can see the whole picture and can see what's going on, and so he's sort of boasting about how great it is that all these imaginary creatures are going to get killed, and they're going to be used for evil purposes back in the human realm. It's a very actually kind of chilling passage.
Huh. I mean, because there's this really interesting, when you're talking about the book, there's this really interesting analogy you make where you say that you think that the imagination is like a muscle. And because the imagination is always portrayed as the more you imagine things, the more you might lose yourself in what you imagine. But you say really the more you exercise your imagination, the more you develop an ability to distinguish what's imaginary from what isn't.
I think that's right. And there's some studies suggesting this. So there's a psychologist at UT who primarily studies how children are able to discern the difference between things, between real and imaginary. And she says actually by a pretty early age, kids can distinguish real things from imaginary things. But I think that, some people are not comfortable with role-playing games, right? That there's a discomfort there that I don't think I could manage being able to imagine both the real world and this alternative world at the same time, right? But people who can handle that, who can handle role-playing games, often will say, well, that was really fun. Now let's do an alternate reality game where it's not even announced that it's a game, right? But we can kind of do these sorts of really advanced things on the internet that involve trying to sort of create a confusion about whether this is a role-playing game or not. So I see on the one hand some people going further and further along this and getting really, really good at being able to, in their mind, maintain these different frames of reality all at the same time, and it's fun and it's a source of pleasure. And on the other hand, I see people that, they don't really even like to read a fiction book, right? That's kind of disturbing to them. So I do think this is true that instead of getting sucked deeper and deeper into your imagination, I think the more people play these kinds of games, they develop a new capacity for thinking about things that they wouldn't otherwise have. So this is another way where I actually think that role-playing games are very empowering and actually have a lot of social significance.
Right, and you kind of quote Karen Armstrong and Peter Berger to the extent that there's kind of different layers of meaning, and there's things that are literally true and have meaning, and there's things that are literally not true and have no meaning, but then there's also things that are literally not true but have meaning, and that the more biblical literalist mind frame has trouble realizing that this middle ground exists between the two.
Yeah, that's right. So I have a chapter talking about how the imagination became dangerous. So Karen Armstrong is a very popular author on religion, and she was a nun for a while. But she came up with these terms mythos and logos, and she said basically human beings need two different kinds of knowledge, right? So logos is basically science and knowledge that is objectively true in a scientific and historical sense. And of course, we need that to develop technologies and cure diseases and this sort of stuff. But that humans also need a different kind of knowledge, which she calls mythos. And what mythos can do is it can answer big questions that science can't answer, right? How ought we to live? What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to be a human being, right? This sort of thing. What happens when we die, which I think a lot of people would say science cannot ultimately answer. So she sees the rise of fundamentalism as basically sort of throwing away mythos, right? So an attempt to take a text like the book of Genesis, which on the one hand is an account of how the world came to be, which we could interpret historically and scientifically. But much more than that is this great story about what it means to be human and what your relationship to God is and what goes wrong when humans think that they could become like God. And it sort of has this much kind of deeper meaning. But when the fundamentalist movement occurred in the 20s is when it went underway, they said, no. Genesis is true in a historic and scientific way, or it's just worthless, right? So we've got to prove that the earth is only 6,000 years old and this sort of thing. So I think that move to begin thinking about the Bible as having only one meaning, whereas historically it was understood that the Bible has a wealth of meanings, right? There's many ways to interpret it. I think that kind of set a certain Christian culture down the road to where they had this really bizarre relationship with the imagination and came to see the imagination as something dangerous instead of something positive and divine that the way Tolkien saw it.
Yeah. Okay, I also really want to ask you about this quote. So you say, a number of scholars have suggested that in a secular age, fantasy role-playing games are a kind of substitute for the sense of enchantment once provided by religion.
Yeah, so Mircea Eliade was this famous historian of religion in the 60s and created a lot of the terms that are still used in religious studies today. And right before he died, he was really interested in things like Marvel Comics. He was really interested in the idea that Thor had become a comic book character. And he said, we're becoming this more secular society, but he said people still need these kinds of epic stories. They still need heroes. And if they can't get that through their religion, they're going to get it through movies and novels and things like this, because humans cannot live without that mythos, right? Without some kind of imaginative source of meaning. And so in some ways, I think that's true. I think that for people who, would say, well, I'm a nun, right? So in more recent sociological surveys, more and more Americans are saying, I have no religion. There's a lot of literature suggesting that fantasy role-playing games or Star Wars or things like this can kind of take on some of the work that religion used to do. Not in the sense that people think that, Anakin Skywalker is a real person or something, but that these stories kind of give them that sense of psychological fulfillment that in other cultures might have been fulfilled by, hearing stories about the lives of the saints or something like this.
Right, because I would certainly put myself in that category. I'm an atheist, a philosophical materialist, but as I mentioned, fantasy fiction is one of my all-time favorite things in this world. And I do feel that, I don't know, there's just maybe a part of our brain that's tickled by the numinous and the transcendent, and fantasy literature allows us to tickle that part of the brain without I would say a lot of the negative consequences that flow from believing that these stories are literally true.
Right. And how crazy would it be for a Star Wars fan to say, well, I can prove that this really happened in a galaxy far, far away, right, a long, long time ago. But if I can't prove that, then no one should watch these movies because they have no value, right? And so that's what someone like Karen Armstrong would say is kind of the tragedy of fundamentalism, is that fundamentalism, instead of celebrating all the sorts of values that are unique to religion, capitulated to the materialists and said, okay, yeah, it's materialism or bust. That's the only thing that matters.
Right. So we're almost out of time. Just talk about, Joseph, what kind of reactions have you gotten to this book? Do you get letters, angry or otherwise, from people in response to it?
I don't think I've gotten any angry letters. I do think that this debate is, for the most part, over, right? I don't think that anyone is going to kind of raise a serious charge that D&D is a dangerous game, except in very kind of sheltered churches and things like that. But I've mostly gotten a lot of mail from people who said that they feel kind of vindicated by this, which is partly what I was trying to do, to kind of avenge my sixth grade self, being told I worship gods from books. I think the only people who've been upset are people who fundamentally misunderstand the argument of the book. So I have had some people that thought I was trying to say, if you play D&D, that is your religion, right? And so you can't be an atheist and a D&D player, or you can't be a Christian and a D&D player. And that's not what I'm saying at all, right? Religion is really a second order category, which means religion scholars sit in our offices and we look at stuff around the world and we kind of decide, does that seem like religion or not? So I think that's been the most kind of the biggest critique of the book right now is that misunderstanding. I'm not telling people that this is a religion. It's a comparison, and it's sort of looking at what shakes out when we line up religion and D&D together.
Right. And so what's next for you? Are you going to write any more about the subject, or do you have another book you're working on, or what's going on?
Well, right now I've gotten very interested in what I call political Satanism. So it's an epitaph at one of the first chapters of the book from this incident at Harvard where this group called the Satanic Temple tried to organize a black mass as part of a cultural display. And an ethics professor said, this may be tasteless, but this is an important part of kind of freedom of speech, and we should go ahead and do it. And then he said, and if you guys say I'm only taking this position because I'm secretly a Satanist, I will blame this whole thing on D&D, right? So I am very interested in this figure called Lucian Greaves, who wants to, who tried to erect a monument to Satan in front of the Oklahoma Capitol. And this has become kind of a big movement of people basically trying to claim the rights that have sort of always, or have generally been afforded to Christians, but as Satanists, right? So their argument is, if you're letting the Christians do it, we want to be able to do it too. We want to have Christmas displays, we want to have monuments and this sort of thing. And so I think this is actually a very interesting cultural moment in kind of, how we interpret the First Amendment, claims that America was founded as a Christian nation, and this sort of thing. And I'm sort of well positioned to analyze that because I've done all this research on Satanic Panic, right? Because in a way, the Satanic Panic of the 80s created Lucian Greaves, right? He's part of our generation and grew up with all of those stories as well. So if Christians are annoyed by his antics, they kind of created him, right? He's kind of coming home to roost. So that's sort of what I'm working on these days as my next project.
All right, so unfortunately we're all out of time. I mean, there's so much stuff in this book we could talk about. I was saying before we got started that there's a whole section on White Wolf and the Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game and the real-life vampire movement and therianthropes. It's all sorts of just crazy stuff. But people, you should go out and check out this book if you want the full story. It's called Dangerous Games, What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds. And the author is Joseph P. Laycock. So, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Joseph Laycock for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Miss Pod and Snow Mossop, who both live in the UK. Miss Pod writes, "Great insight into sci-fi creators. This is a must for either fans or aspiring writers/screenwriters of sci-fi. There's just so much insight into the way the individuals and industries producing sci-fi fantasy films, games, and books get their projects off the ground. I love this." So big thanks again to Miss Pod for that great review. Special thanks as well to Stephen Klotz, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.